There are gifts that destroy lives in silence. On December 24, 1861, in a plantation house near Natchez, Mississippi, a woman named Eleanor Hartwell unwrapped a Christmas present from her husband, a young enslaved boy, no older than 14, with eyes she had seen before. The household staff watched her face drain of color as she stared at the child. She did not speak. She did not move. For 3 full minutes, she stood frozen in the parlor while the boy looked at her with confusion and something else, recognition. What her husband did not know, what no one in that room could have imagined, was that Eleanor had given birth to a son 15 years earlier, a child she was told had died hours after delivery. The boy standing before her bore a birthmark on his left wrist, a crescent-shaped scar she had kissed once in a moment of desperate love before they took him away. This is the story of how a secret, buried for over a decade, surfaced on the holiest night of the year, and how the truth unraveled 2 lives bound by blood and separated by an unforgivable lie. Eleanor Hartwell had not always been a plantation mistress. She was born Eleanor Gaines in 1827, the youngest daughter of a modest merchant family in Charleston, South Carolina. Her father, Robert Gaines, dealt in textiles imported from England and France, selling fine fabrics to the wealthy families who built Charleston's reputation as the jewel of the South. Her mother, Constance, was a woman of rigid social ambition who saw her daughters as investments, each one a potential alliance with a family of greater standing, greater wealth, greater influence. Eleanor was the third of 4 daughters, which meant she occupied a peculiar position in the family hierarchy. She was not the eldest, who bore the weight of family expectations, nor the youngest, who was indulged and coddled. She existed in a middle space where she was largely overlooked, which gave her a dangerous kind of freedom. While her sisters practiced their needlework and memorized the names of eligible bachelors, Eleanor spent hours in her father's library, reading books she was not supposed to touch. Volumes of poetry, philosophy, abolitionist pamphlets that her father kept hidden behind the respectable texts. She was 17 in the spring of 1844 when she met Thomas. He was not enslaved, which was itself remarkable. He was a free black man, born to parents who had purchased their freedom decades earlier in Virginia and migrated south to Charleston, where they established a small carpentry business. Thomas had inherited his father's skill with wood and his mother's quiet dignity. He was 23, tall and lean, with hands that could shape raw timber into something beautiful. He came to the Gaines household to repair the warehouse where Robert stored his imported fabrics. The building had suffered damage during a storm, and Thomas spent 3 weeks rebuilding the damaged sections, replacing rotted beams, reinforcing the structure. Eleanor watched him work from the window of her father's office. She watched the way he moved, the precision of his hands, the concentration on his face. She told herself she was simply curious, that there was nothing improper about observing a craftsman at his trade, but curiosity became something else. She began finding excuses to walk past the warehouse, to bring him water on hot afternoons, to ask questions about his work. Thomas was polite but distant at first, aware of the danger inherent in any interaction between them. But Eleanor was persistent, and eventually his reserve cracked. They began to talk about books, about the city, about the world beyond Charleston. Thomas had taught himself to read, a fact that astonished and impressed Eleanor. He spoke about freedom not as an abstract concept, but as something tangible, something he had tasted and would never relinquish. Their affair began in June. It was reckless, impossible, and inevitable. They met in secret in the warehouse after dark, in the gardens behind the house when the family was away. Eleanor knew the risks. She had been raised on stories of white women who had fallen, who had been ruined, who had been cast out of society for lesser transgressions. But she was 17 and in love, and she believed with the naive certainty of youth that love could transcend the brutal realities of the world they lived in. By August, she knew she was pregnant. The realization came slowly, then all at once. The missed courses, the nausea, the way her body felt foreign to her. She told Thomas, and she saw fear flash across his face, quickly suppressed. They discussed running away, going north, starting a new life where no one knew them. But Thomas knew the truth that Eleanor was only beginning to understand. There was no place in America where they could live openly, where their child would be safe, where they would not be hunted. Before they could make a decision, Eleanor's mother discovered the truth. Constance had always been observant, and she noticed the changes in her daughter, the pallor, the secrecy, the way Eleanor's dresses were beginning to fit differently. She confronted Eleanor in her bedroom one evening in September, and Eleanor, exhausted by the weight of the secret, confessed everything. What followed was swift and brutal. Robert Gaines confronted Thomas the next day in front of witnesses and accused him of theft. It was a lie, but it was a lie that would be believed. Thomas was arrested, held for 3 days, and then released with a warning. Leave Charleston, or face worse. He left that night. Eleanor never saw him again. She did not know if he had tried to contact her, if he had thought of her, if he had even known what happened to their child. Her parents made sure she would never find out. Eleanor was sent away in October to a distant cousin's estate in rural Georgia, far from Charleston, far from anyone who might recognize her. The cousin, a widow named Abigail Brennan, ran a small plantation with the help of an overseer and a dozen enslaved workers. She was a cold, practical woman who viewed Eleanor's situation with contempt but agreed to house her for a fee. Eleanor spent the next 6 months in a kind of purgatory, confined to the house, forbidden from speaking to anyone outside the family, waiting for the pregnancy to end. The labor began on a cold night in March 1845. Eleanor was alone except for Dinah, an enslaved woman who served as the plantation's midwife. Dinah was in her 40s with strong hands and a face that revealed nothing. She had delivered dozens of babies, both white and black, and she approached the task with the same detached efficiency she brought to every aspect of her work. The labor lasted 14 hours. Eleanor screamed until her voice gave out, clutched the bedsheets until her knuckles turned white, begged for it to end. When the baby finally came, Dinah caught him in her hands, wiped the blood from his face, and held him up for Eleanor to see. He was small, barely 6 pounds, with dark skin and a shock of black hair. His eyes, when they opened, were grey. Eleanor's eyes. Eleanor reached for him, and Dinah placed him in her arms. For 1 minute, maybe less, Eleanor held her son. She looked at his face, memorized every detail, kissed the crescent-shaped birthmark on his left wrist. A mark she had been born with, a mark her mother had, a mark that went back generations in her family. She whispered to him words she would never remember, promises she could never keep. And then Dinah took him away. Abigail came into the room an hour later and told Eleanor the child had died. She said it matter-of-factly, as if reporting the weather. She said it was common for babies born of such circumstances to be weak, to fail to thrive, to slip away in the night. She said Eleanor should be grateful, that it was a mercy, that it spared everyone the complications that would have followed. She said the body had already been buried, that there was no need for Eleanor to see it, that it was better this way. Eleanor did not believe her. But she was 17 years old, alone and powerless. She had no allies, no resources, no way to challenge the story she was being told. She lay in bed for 3 days, staring at the ceiling, feeling the emptiness where the baby had been. When she finally rose, she was a different person. The girl who had loved Thomas, who had believed in the possibility of a different life, was gone. In her place was a woman who understood that the world was not kind, that love was not enough, that survival required sacrifice. She returned to Charleston in April. Her parents told their social circle that Eleanor had been visiting relatives, recovering from a minor illness. No one questioned the story. Eleanor resumed her place in the household, attended social functions, smiled at appropriate moments. She did not speak of Thomas or the baby or the months in Georgia. She buried it all so deep that sometimes in the years that followed, she almost believed it had never happened. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. In the fall of 1847, Eleanor met William Hartwell. He was 42 years old, a widower whose first wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier, leaving him with a plantation to run and no heirs to inherit it. He was not handsome, his face was too severe, his manner too brusque, but he was wealthy, respectable, and in need of a wife. Eleanor's parents saw an opportunity. They arranged an introduction, encouraged the courtship, and made it clear to Eleanor that this was her chance to secure her future. Eleanor accepted his proposal in December. She did not love him, but she had learned that love was a luxury she could not afford. William offered stability, security, a life far from Charleston and the ghosts that haunted her there. They married in February 1848 in a small ceremony attended by both families. Eleanor wore a white dress that felt like a shroud. Hartwell Plantation was located 10 miles outside Natchez, Mississippi, on a bend of the Mississippi River. The house was a grand structure of white columns and wide verandas, surrounded by oak trees draped in Spanish moss. Behind the house stretched 2,000 acres of cotton fields, worked by over 100 enslaved people. It was a world unto itself, isolated and insular, governed by William's iron will. Eleanor's role was clearly defined. She was to manage the household, oversee the domestic staff, host dinners and social gatherings, and provide William with children, preferably sons. She performed these duties with the same detached efficiency she had learned in Georgia. She learned the names of the enslaved workers, though she did not allow herself to know them. She learned to give orders, to maintain discipline, to turn a blind eye to the cruelties that were part of the plantation's daily operation. She gave birth to her first daughter, Catherine, in November 1850. The labor was easier than the first time, and the baby was healthy, with William's dark hair and Eleanor's gray eyes. William was disappointed. He had wanted a son, but he accepted the child with a kind of resigned patience. Eleanor held Catherine and felt nothing. She fed her, cared for her, performed all the duties of motherhood, but there was a distance between them that never closed. Her second daughter, Margaret, was born in June 1853. William's disappointment was more pronounced this time. He began to speak of Eleanor's failure to provide him with an heir, to question whether she was capable of bearing sons. Eleanor endured his criticisms in silence. She had learned over the years that silence was her most effective defense. The years passed in a kind of numb routine. Eleanor managed the household, raised her daughters, attended church services and social functions. She became known in Natchez society as a competent, if somewhat cold, plantation mistress. She did not form close friendships. She kept everyone at a distance, afraid that intimacy would lead to questions she could not answer. But at night, alone in her room, she thought of the baby she had held for 1 minute in Georgia. She thought of his gray eyes, his dark skin, the crescent-shaped birthmark on his wrist. She thought of Thomas, wondered if he was still alive, if he ever thought of her. She thought of the life she might have had, the person she might have been, if the world had been different. She did not allow herself to weep. Tears were a luxury, like love, and she had learned to live without luxuries. By 1860, the country was fracturing. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November sent shockwaves through the South. In Mississippi, the talk was all of secession, of states' rights, of the need to protect the Southern way of life. William Hartwell was a fervent supporter of secession. He attended rallies, donated money to the cause, spoke passionately about the threat posed by the North. He believed, with absolute certainty, that the South would prevail, that the institution of slavery was ordained by God and protected by law. Mississippi seceded from the Union on January 9, 1861. William celebrated with champagne and speeches. Eleanor watched from the sidelines, saying nothing. She had learned over the years to keep her thoughts to herself. But privately, she felt a growing sense of dread. She had read enough history to know that wars did not end quickly, that they consumed everything in their path, that they left nothing unchanged. The war began in April with the firing on Fort Sumter. By summer, young men from Natchez were enlisting in the Confederate Army, marching off to Virginia and Tennessee with flags and songs. William was too old to fight, but he contributed in other ways, sending supplies, money, horses. He spoke often of the righteousness of the cause, of the need to defend Southern honor. Eleanor said nothing, but she began to notice changes in the plantation. The enslaved workers were quieter, more watchful. There were whispers of Union troops moving through the region, of enslaved people escaping to Union lines, of a world turning upside down. William responded with increased discipline, harsher punishments, a tightening of control. Eleanor watched and said nothing. In November 1861, William traveled to New Orleans on business. He was gone for 2 weeks. When he returned, it was December 23rd, the day before Christmas Eve. He arrived in the late afternoon, his carriage loaded with packages and supplies. He was in high spirits, pleased with the success of his trip. He had sold a large portion of the plantation's cotton crop at a favorable price, secured contracts for the coming year, and purchased gifts for the family. Among the gifts was a boy. William presented the boy to Eleanor on Christmas Eve in the parlor, in front of the household staff and their 2 daughters. He had wrapped the boy's bill of sale in festive paper, as if he were a toy or a piece of jewelry. He handed the package to Eleanor with a smile, clearly pleased with himself. "I thought you could use another house servant," he said. "The boy comes highly recommended. He's been trained in kitchen work and general service. His name is Samuel." Eleanor took the package with numb fingers. She unwrapped it slowly, her hands shaking. Inside was a legal document, a bill of sale from a trader in New Orleans. The document listed the boy's name as Samuel, his approximate age as 14, his skills as house service and kitchen work, and his distinguishing marks as crescent-shaped scar, left wrist. Eleanor's vision narrowed. The words on the page blurred. She looked up, and for the first time she really saw the boy standing in the corner of the room. He was tall for his age, thin, with dark skin and sharp features. His hair was cut short. His clothes were clean but worn. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes downcast, in the posture of someone who had learned to make himself invisible. But when Eleanor stared at him, he looked up and their eyes met. Gray eyes. Her eyes. Eleanor felt the room tilt. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. The boy's face. She knew that face. She saw herself in the shape of his nose, the line of his jaw. She saw Thomas in the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself. And when the boy shifted his weight, his sleeve rode up, and she saw it. The crescent-shaped birthmark on his left wrist, faint but unmistakable. "Eleanor?" William's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Eleanor could not speak. She could not breathe. She stared at the boy, and the boy stared back. And in his eyes, she saw confusion and something else, a flicker of recognition, as if he too sensed something familiar, something impossible. "Ma'am?" The boy's voice was soft, uncertain. "Are you unwell?" Eleanor dropped the bill of sale. It fluttered to the floor. She turned and walked out of the room, her steps mechanical, her mind reeling. Behind her she heard William's voice, annoyed and confused, asking what was wrong. She did not answer. She walked through the house, up the stairs, into her bedroom and closed the door. She stood in the center of the room, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short gasps. The boy was alive. Her son was alive. After 16 years, after a lifetime of believing he was dead, of mourning him in secret, of carrying the weight of his loss, he was alive. And he was here, in her house, enslaved, owned by her husband, standing in her parlor like a piece of furniture. Eleanor sank to the floor, her legs giving out beneath her. She pressed her hands to her mouth to stifle the sound that was rising in her throat. A sound that was part sob, part scream, part something she had no name for. She had spent 16 years learning to live with the loss of her son. She had built a life on the foundation of that loss, had shaped herself around the absence of him. And now, in one moment, everything she had believed, everything she had accepted, was revealed to be a lie. He had not died. They had sold him. Her family had taken her newborn son and sold him into slavery, and they had told her he was dead, so she would never look for him. The realization was a physical blow. Eleanor doubled over, gasping for air, her mind racing. Who had done this? Her cousin Abigail, the midwife Dinah, her parents, all of them. And why? To erase the evidence of her transgression, to protect the family's reputation, to punish her. And the boy, Samuel they called him, did he know? Did he have any idea who she was? Or had he been told, like she had been told, a lie designed to keep them apart? Eleanor did not sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind churning. She thought of the boy downstairs, sleeping in the quarters with the other house servants, unaware that his mother was lying awake 20 feet above him. She thought of all the years they had lost, all the moments that had been stolen from them. She thought of the impossibility of the situation. He was her son, but he was also her property. She was his mother, but she was also his owner. The law did not recognize their bond. Society would not acknowledge it. And even if she could prove it, even if she could show the world the matching birthmarks, the undeniable resemblance, what would it change? Nothing. It would change nothing. Eleanor rose before dawn. She dressed quickly, her hands shaking, and made her way downstairs. The house was still dark, the servants not yet awake. She walked through the silent rooms, past the parlor where the boy had stood the night before, out the back door, across the yard to the quarters where the house servants slept. The quarters were a row of small wooden cabins, each one housing 4 to 6 people. Eleanor had been in them before, to inspect the conditions, to ensure that the servants were healthy enough to work. But she had never gone there alone, in the dark, before anyone else was awake. She found the cabin where the house servants slept and pushed open the door. Inside, it was cramped and dim, lit only by the faint glow of a dying fire in the hearth. She could make out the shapes of bodies on narrow cots, hear the sound of breathing. She stood in the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the darkness, until she saw him. The boy, Samuel, sitting on a cot in the corner, awake, staring at his hands. "Samuel," she whispered. He looked up, startled. For a moment they stared at each other in the darkness. Then he stood quickly, his posture shifting into the deferential stance she had seen the night before. "Mom," he said quietly, "is something wrong?" Eleanor stepped into the cabin, closing the door behind her. The other servants stirred but did not wake. She moved closer to the boy, close enough to see his face in the dim light. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Where were you born?" The boy blinked, confused. "Ma'am, where were you born?" Eleanor repeated. "Who raised you? What do you remember?" Samuel hesitated. He glanced at the other sleeping figures, then back at Eleanor. "I was born in Georgia, Ma'am, on a plantation near Savannah. I was told my mother was a slave who died when I was born." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "Who told you that?" "The woman who raised me. Her name was Dinah. She worked in the kitchens. She took care of me until I was 12, and then..." He trailed off, his eyes dropping to the floor. "And then what?" Eleanor pressed. "And then she died, Ma'am, and I was sold. I've been sold twice since then. The last time was in New Orleans to your husband." Eleanor's mind was racing. Dinah, the same Dinah who had delivered her baby in Georgia, the same Dinah who had taken him away and told her he was dead. Dinah had not killed the child. She had kept him. She had raised him. And then, when she died, he had been sold. "Do you remember anything about your mother?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anything Dinah told you?" Samuel looked at her, his expression guarded. "She said my mother was young. She said she was kind. She said she didn't want to give me up, but she had no choice." He paused, then added, "She said my mother had gray eyes, like mine." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. She reached out, her hand trembling, and gently took the boy's left wrist. She pushed up his sleeve, revealing the crescent-shaped birthmark. Then she pulled back her own sleeve, showing him the matching mark on her wrist. Samuel stared at the two marks, his eyes widening. He looked up at Eleanor, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. "I'm your mother," Eleanor whispered. "I gave birth to you 16 years ago in Georgia. They told me you were dead. I believed them. I mourned you, but you were alive. You were alive all this time." Samuel pulled his wrist away, stepping back. He shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "No," he said quietly. "That's not possible." "It is," Eleanor insisted. "Look at the marks, look at my eyes. You have my eyes, Samuel." "You're my son." Samuel continued to shake his head. "If that's true," he said, his voice hardening, "then why am I a slave? Why did you let your husband buy me? Why are you standing here in the dark instead of freeing me?" Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The boy was right. If she was his mother, if she truly cared about him, why had she done nothing? Why had she allowed him to remain enslaved, to serve her, to sleep in this cramped cabin with strangers? "I didn't know," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I only realized last night when I saw you. I didn't know you were alive. I thought you were dead." "But you know now," Samuel said, "and I'm still here, still a slave." Eleanor felt the weight of his words like a physical blow. She wanted to explain, to make him understand the impossibility of her situation, the constraints she operated under. But she knew, even as the excuses formed in her mind, that they were hollow. She was his mother, and she had done nothing. "I'll find a way," she said desperately. "I'll find a way to free you. I promise." Samuel looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes, her eyes, filled with something that looked like pity. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Mom," he said quietly. Then he turned away, lying back down on his cot, his back to her. Eleanor stood there for a moment longer, her heart breaking. Then she turned and left the cabin, walking back across the yard to the big house as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. In the days that followed, Eleanor became obsessed with uncovering the truth. She needed to know exactly what had happened, who had been involved, why they had lied to her. She began writing letters to her cousin Abigail in Georgia, to anyone who might have known Dinah, to the slave traders who had sold Samuel. Most of her letters went unanswered. Those that did receive responses were vague, evasive, or outright hostile. Abigail wrote back once, a brief cold note that said only, "The matter was handled appropriately at the time. I suggest you do not dwell on the past. It serves no purpose." Eleanor wanted to scream. Handled appropriately. As if her son were a problem to be solved, a mess to be cleaned up. She wrote back, demanding details, demanding names, demanding to know who had made the decision to sell her child. Abigail did not respond. Eleanor tried a different approach. She began questioning Samuel, carefully, indirectly, piecing together the fragments of his life. She learned that Dinah had been kind to him, had protected him as much as she could within the brutal confines of plantation life. Dinah had taught him to read, in secret, using a Bible she had somehow acquired. She had told him stories about his mother, stories that Eleanor now realized were true, or close to true. She said, "My mother loved me," Samuel told her one afternoon, when Eleanor had found him alone in the kitchen. She said, "My mother held me and cried when they took me away." She said, "My mother didn't want to give me up." Eleanor felt tears stream down her face. "That's true," she whispered. "All of it is true." Samuel looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then why did you?" "I didn't have a choice," Eleanor said. "I was 17. I had no power, no money, no way to fight them. They told me you were dead, and I believed them because I had no reason not to." "And now?" Samuel asked. "Do you have power now? Do you have a choice?" Eleanor wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell him that she would find a way, that she would free him, that they would be a family. But she knew the truth. William controlled everything. The money, the property, the legal documents. She had no independent resources, no way to purchase Samuel's freedom without William's knowledge and consent. And William would never consent. He would see it as a betrayal, a violation of the natural order. He might even suspect the truth, and if he did, the consequences would be catastrophic. "I'm trying," Eleanor said weakly. "I'm trying to find a way." Samuel nodded slowly, but she could see the disappointment in his eyes. He turned back to his work, and Eleanor left the kitchen, feeling more helpless than she had ever felt in her life. As the weeks passed, the tension in the household became unbearable. Eleanor could barely look at William without feeling a surge of rage and resentment. He had bought her son, had brought him into their home as property, and he had no idea what he had done. He noticed Eleanor's distraction, her moodiness, but he attributed it to the stress of the war, the uncertainty of the times. Samuel moved through the house like a ghost. He performed his duties efficiently, quietly, never drawing attention to himself. But Eleanor could feel his presence constantly, could sense him in every room, could hear his footsteps in the halls. She found herself watching him, memorizing the details of his face, the way he moved, the sound of his voice. She was trying to make up for 16 years of absence, trying to know him, but the gulf between them was vast and unbridgeable. Catherine and Margaret, Eleanor's daughters, were oblivious to the undercurrents. They were 10 and 8 years old, absorbed in their own world of lessons and play. They treated Samuel the way they treated all the house servants, with casual indifference, occasionally issuing orders, occasionally complaining if something was not done to their satisfaction. Eleanor watched them interact with their half-brother, and she felt a deep, abiding shame. In February, William announced that he would be traveling to Jackson for a week to attend a series of meetings about the war effort. Eleanor saw an opportunity. As soon as William's carriage disappeared down the drive, she went looking for Samuel. She found him in the parlor, polishing silver. "Come with me," she said. Samuel looked up, surprised. "Ma'am?" "Come with me," Eleanor repeated. "I need to talk to you, alone." Samuel set down the silver and followed her to the library, a small room at the back of the house that William used as his office. Eleanor closed the door and turned to face him. "I need to tell you everything," she said. "I need you to know the truth, all of it." And so she told him. She told him about Thomas, about the affair, about the pregnancy. She told him about being sent to Georgia, about the labor, about holding him for 1 minute before Dinah took him away. She told him about being told he was dead, about the years of grief, about the way she had buried the pain so deep she had almost forgotten how to feel it. She told him about her marriage to William, about her daughters, about the life she had built on the foundation of loss. Samuel listened in silence, his face expressionless. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you want from me?" Eleanor was taken aback. "What do you mean? What do you want from me?" Samuel repeated, "Do you want me to forgive you? Do you want me to call you mother? Do you want me to be grateful that you finally told me the truth?" "I want." Eleanor trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. What did she want? She wanted to undo the past, to reclaim the years they had lost, to be his mother in more than just blood. But she knew that was impossible. "You're my owner," Samuel said, his voice flat. "You own me. That's the only relationship we can have. The law says so. Society says so. Even if you wanted to free me, even if you could, what then? Where would I go? What would I do? I'm a slave, ma'am. That's all I've ever been. That's all I'll ever be." "That's not true," Eleanor said desperately. "The war is changing things. The Union is winning. Slavery won't last forever." Samuel laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Maybe, but I might not last that long. And even if I do, even if I survive, even if I'm freed, what difference does it make? You'll still be the woman who owned me. You'll still be the woman who knew I was her son and did nothing." Eleanor felt as if she had been slapped. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Fair?" Samuel's voice rose, the first time she had heard real emotion from him. "You want to talk about fair? I was sold, ma'am. I was sold by the people who were supposed to protect me. I was raised by a woman who wasn't my mother, who loved me but couldn't save me. I've been owned by 3 different people, worked in fields and kitchens, been beaten and starved and treated like an animal. And now I find out that my real mother is alive, that she's been alive this whole time, that she's a wealthy white woman who could have looked for me, could have tried to find me, but didn't. So don't talk to me about fair." Eleanor was crying now, openly, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't know," she sobbed. "I didn't know you were alive. If I had known, I would have done anything to find you." Samuel looked at her, and for a moment his expression softened. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But you know now, and you're still not doing anything." He turned and walked out of the library, leaving Eleanor alone with her grief. Eleanor spent the next few days in a kind of fog. She went through the motions of her daily routine, managing the household, overseeing the servants, caring for her daughters. But her mind was elsewhere. She kept replaying the conversation with Samuel, hearing his words over and over again. "You're still not doing anything." He was right. She was paralyzed by fear, by the impossibility of the situation, by the knowledge that any action she took could make things worse. But inaction was also a choice, and it was a choice that was destroying her. She began to consider her options. She could try to convince William to free Samuel, but she knew he would refuse. He would want to know why she was so invested in this particular slave, and she could not tell him the truth. She could try to buy Samuel's freedom herself, but she had no money of her own. Everything belonged to William. She could try to help Samuel escape, but the risks were enormous. If he were caught, he would be punished severely, possibly killed. And if it were discovered that she had helped him, she would face legal consequences, social ostracism, possibly even imprisonment. But doing nothing meant watching her son live as a slave, watching him serve her, watching the distance between them grow wider every day. It meant living with the knowledge that she had failed him, not once but twice. Eleanor made a decision. She could not free Samuel, not legally, not safely, but she could give him something else. She could give him the truth about his father. She waited until William returned from Jackson, until the household settled back into its routine. Then, one evening, she went to Samuel's cabin again. He was alone this time, sitting on his cot, reading a small, worn Bible. The same one Dinah had given him, she realized. "Samuel," she said softly. He looked up, his expression wary. "Ma'am, I want to tell you about your father," Eleanor said. Samuel closed the Bible, setting it aside. "All right." Eleanor sat down on the edge of the cot, keeping a respectful distance. "His name was Thomas," she began. "He was a free black man, a carpenter. He was kind, intelligent, brave. He taught himself to read. He believed in freedom, in justice, in the possibility of a better world. I loved him. I loved him more than I've ever loved anyone." She told Samuel everything she remembered about Thomas, the way he smiled, the way he spoke, the way his hands moved when he worked with wood. She told him about their conversations, their dreams, their plans to run away together. She told him about the day Thomas was arrested, the day he was forced to leave Charleston, the way she had never seen him again. "I don't know if he's still alive," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I don't know if he ever knew about you. But I want you to know that he was a good man, that you come from goodness, even if the world has tried to convince you otherwise." Samuel was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Thank you." Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face. She stood to leave, but Samuel stopped her. "Ma'am," he said. "Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her name. She turned back to him. "I don't forgive you," he said quietly. "I can't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I believe you. I believe you didn't know. And I believe you loved him. That's something." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. She left the cabin and walked back to the house, feeling something shift inside her. It was not forgiveness, not redemption, but it was a beginning. By March 1862, the war was no longer a distant abstraction. Union forces were advancing through Tennessee, moving toward Mississippi. There were reports of battles, of towns occupied, of plantations burned. The enslaved population was restless, sensing that change was coming. Some had already fled, disappearing into the night, heading toward Union lines. William was increasingly agitated. He spent his days poring over maps and newspapers, ranting about Union aggression, about the need to defend Southern honor. He increased security on the plantation, hired additional overseers, instituted harsher punishments for any sign of disobedience. Eleanor watched the escalation with growing dread. In late March, a Union cavalry unit passed through the area. It was a small force, a scouting party, but their presence sent shockwaves through the region. They did not attack Hartwell Plantation directly, but they burned 2 barns on a neighboring estate and freed several enslaved people. William was furious. He called a meeting of the plantation owners in the area, and they discussed forming a militia, increasing patrols, taking more aggressive measures to prevent escapes. Eleanor saw an opportunity. With William distracted, with the chaos of the war providing cover, perhaps Samuel could escape. She approached him one evening in the kitchen when no one else was around. "The Union troops are close," she said quietly. "If you wanted to leave, now would be the time." Samuel looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You're telling me to run?" "I'm telling you that you have a chance," Eleanor said. "I can't free you legally, but I can look the other way. I can make sure no one notices you're gone until it's too late." Samuel was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Why now? Why are you suddenly willing to help me?" "Because I've been a coward," Eleanor said. "Because I've let fear control me. Because I've done nothing, and doing nothing is the same as being complicit. I can't undo the past, Samuel, but I can give you a future." Samuel studied her face, searching for something, sincerity, perhaps, or courage. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll go, but not yet. I need to wait for the right moment." "When?" Eleanor asked. "I'll know," Samuel said. "Trust me." Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist that he leave immediately, but she knew he was right. Timing was everything. She nodded and left the kitchen, her heart pounding. The opportunity came 2 weeks later. On April 10th, there was another Union raid, this one larger and more aggressive. A full regiment passed through the area, burning supply depots, freeing enslaved people, engaging in skirmishes with Confederate militia. Hartwell Plantation was not directly attacked, but the chaos was widespread. William and the overseers were occupied with trying to secure the property to prevent the enslaved workers from fleeing. In the confusion, Samuel disappeared. Eleanor noticed his absence almost immediately. She had been watching him constantly, waiting for this moment. When she realized he was gone, she felt a surge of relief, followed quickly by terror. She knew what would happen when William discovered the escape. He would organize a search party, would send men with dogs to track Samuel down. She had to buy him time. She waited until evening, until the household had settled, before she mentioned to William that she had not seen Samuel all day. William was exhausted, distracted, and he waved off her concern. "Probably hiding somewhere," he muttered. "They're all scared right now. He'll turn up." But the next morning, when Samuel still had not appeared, William realized the truth. He flew into a rage, shouting orders, demanding that the overseers organize a search immediately. Eleanor watched, her heart in her throat, as men mounted horses and rode off in all directions, dogs baying in the distance. They searched for 3 days. They found no trace of Samuel. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. William was furious, but there was nothing he could do. The war had created too much chaos, too many opportunities for escape. Samuel was gone, and he was not coming back. Eleanor felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief, grief, hope, despair. She did not know if Samuel had made it to Union lines, if he had been captured, if he had died trying to escape. She would never know, but she had given him a chance, and that was more than she had done before. The months that followed were difficult. The war continued to rage, and the South was losing. By the summer of 1863, Union forces had taken control of much of Mississippi. Hartwell Plantation was occupied briefly, the house searched, supplies confiscated. William was arrested for a time, accused of supporting the Confederate cause, but he was eventually released. The plantation was in ruins, the fields untended, the enslaved workers freed by Union decree, the house falling into disrepair. Eleanor's daughters, Catherine and Margaret, contracted yellow fever in the summer of 1873. Both died within days of each other. Eleanor buried them in the family plot, beside the graves of William's first wife and infant son. She felt numb, hollowed out, as if she had no grief left to give. William died in 1868 of a stroke. Eleanor was 51 years old, alone in a house that was crumbling around her. She had no money, no family, no purpose. She spent her days wandering the empty rooms, remembering the past, wondering about Samuel. She wrote letters, dozens of them, to freedmen's bureaus, to union officials, to anyone who might have information about a young man named Samuel, last seen in Mississippi in 1862. She described him, his age, his appearance, the crescent-shaped birthmark on his wrist. She did not mention that he was her son. She did not think anyone would believe her. She never received a response. In the winter of 1879, Eleanor knew she was dying. She was 52 years old, but she felt ancient, worn down by grief and guilt. She had developed a persistent cough, and she could feel her strength ebbing away. She knew she did not have much time left. She decided to write a confession. She spent weeks on it, writing and rewriting, trying to capture the truth of what had happened. She wrote about Thomas, about the pregnancy, about the birth. She wrote about being told Samuel was dead, about the years of grief, about the moment she saw him on Christmas Eve. She wrote about the conversations in the library and the cabin, about Samuel's anger and her helplessness, about the decision to help him escape. She wrote, "I do not know if my son survived. I do not know if he found freedom, if he built a life, if he ever thought of me. I hope he did. I hope he found happiness, found love, found a way to forgive the world for what it did to him. I hope he did not forgive me. I do not deserve forgiveness. I was his mother, and I failed him. I knew who he was, and I did nothing. I let fear control me. Let the constraints of society dictate my actions. Let the law and custom and propriety matter more than my own child. I am guilty of the worst kind of cowardice, the cowardice of inaction, and I will carry that guilt to my grave." She sealed the confession in an envelope and placed it with her other papers, along with Samuel's bill of sale. She did not know if anyone would ever read it, but she needed to write it. She needed to tell the truth, even if no one was listening. Eleanor Hartwell died on February 3, 1879. She was buried in the family plot, beside her husband and daughters. The plantation house was abandoned, left to decay. Her confession remained in the house, hidden among old documents and forgotten papers, for over a century. In 1983, a historian named Dr. Rebecca Chen was researching the history of slavery in Mississippi. She had heard rumors of an abandoned plantation house near Natchez, and she decided to investigate. The house was in terrible condition. The roof had collapsed in places, the walls were covered in mold, the floors were rotting. But in what had once been the library, she found a trunk filled with old documents. Among the documents was Eleanor Hartwell's confession. Dr. Chen read it with growing astonishment. She had studied slavery for years, had read countless accounts of the brutality and injustice of the system, but she had never encountered anything quite like this. A first-person account from a white woman who had given birth to an enslaved child, who had been reunited with him years later, who had failed to save him. Dr. Chen spent months verifying the details of the confession. She found records of Eleanor's marriage to William Hartwell, of the births of Catherine and Margaret, of William's death in 1868. She found the bill of sale for a boy named Samuel, purchased in New Orleans in December 1861. She found records of Union raids in the area in April 1862, of enslaved people escaping to Union lines. What she could not find was any record of Samuel after April 1862. She searched Freedmen's Bureau records, Union Army enlistment records, census records from the post-war period. She found dozens of men named Samuel, but none who matched the description in Eleanor's confession. It was as if he had vanished. Dr. Chen published her findings in a scholarly journal, along with excerpts from Eleanor's confession. The article generated significant interest, and other historians began to search for information about Samuel. But despite extensive research, no one has ever been able to determine what happened to him. Did he make it to Union lines? Did he enlist in the Union Army as many formerly enslaved men did? Did he survive the war? Did he build a life, find a family, live to see the end of slavery? Or did he die trying to escape, his body lost in the Mississippi wilderness, his story erased from history? We will never know. The story of Eleanor and Samuel is not unique. Throughout the antebellum South, thousands of children were born of relationships between white women and black men, or white men and enslaved women. Many of these children were sold, their parentage erased, their identities stolen. Families were torn apart by design, by law, by a system that valued property over humanity. Eleanor's confession is one of the few surviving documents that captures this horror from the perspective of someone who was both victim and perpetrator. She was a victim of her family's cruelty, of a society that gave her no power, no agency, no choice. But she was also a perpetrator. She owned enslaved people, she benefited from their labor, and when she finally had the chance to save her son, she hesitated, paralyzed by fear. Her story raises uncomfortable questions. Can we forgive someone who was complicit in an evil system, even if they were also a victim of that system? Can we separate Eleanor's love for her son from her failure to act on that love? Can we understand her choices without excusing them? These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions we must ask, because the legacy of slavery is not a distant historical fact. It is a living reality, woven into the fabric of American society, shaping our laws, our institutions, our understanding of race and power and justice. Eleanor Hartwell received her son as a Christmas gift, and in doing so, she was forced to confront the full horror of the world she lived in. She could not save him. She could not undo the damage that had been done. All she could do was tell the truth and hope that someday someone would listen. And we are listening. We are listening to Eleanor's confession, to Samuel's silence, to the voices of the thousands of people whose stories were erased, whose lives were stolen, whose humanity was denied. We are listening, and we are trying to understand, and we are trying to do better. Because that is all we can do. We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it. We can honor the memory of those who suffered, and we can commit ourselves to building a world where no mother is ever forced to choose between her child and her survival, where no child is ever sold, where no human being is ever treated as property. That is the lesson of Eleanor and Samuel. That is the legacy they left behind, and that is the responsibility we carry forward. Stories like Eleanor's force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past, truths that are often hidden, sanitized, or forgotten. If you found this account as haunting as I did, consider subscribing to this channel. We uncover the darkest corners of American history, the stories that textbooks leave out, the voices that were silenced. There are more stories like this one, waiting to be told. Don't miss them. The house still stands, though it is barely recognizable now. The columns have crumbled, the verandas have collapsed, the oak trees have grown wild. Locals avoid the place, saying it has an unsettling atmosphere. Some claim to hear footsteps in the empty halls, to see shadows moving in the windows. But these are only stories, the kind that grow around places marked by tragedy. The truth is simpler and more terrible. Eleanor Hartwell received her son as a Christmas gift, recognized him, loved him, and lost him. And somewhere, in the chaos of 1862, a boy named Samuel walked away from the only mother he would ever know, carrying with him a truth that changed nothing and everything. His fate remains unknown, but his story, and Eleanor's, endures, a reminder of the countless lives destroyed by slavery, the families torn apart, the bonds severed, the love that was never enough to overcome the brutal machinery of oppression. We remember them, we tell their stories, and we commit ourselves to ensuring that such horrors are never repeated.